Well, if it's recording, I think we'll go.
Oh, great.
Welcome home, Jack.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm very glad to be back.
Oh, fantastic.
For a
In
little
the
bit anyway.
green and pleasant lands.
Yeah.
And welcome to you to Beyond the Text with me, Samuel Woodall.
And me, Jack Thomson.
No talking over each other, no delay.
Perfect.
How wonderful. It's like pre-COVID times. How was your last week in Leiden and your travel back to...
Oh, it was very smooth. I was seeing family in the northwest, so I came to Newcastle.
Fantastic.
First, and I will return to Newcastle because I booked a return flight. But I have four. Good show. I have four 4 days here in London.
Marvellous.
Attending to various seminars. One of which is our seminar on Augustine, City of God, which by the time it is uploaded will have passed.
Yes, with my
it
slow
will be
upload.
uploaded. No. But it will be available on YouTube.
But you don't actually know when this is recorded, so as far as I'm concerned, this recording goes out straight after we've done it, because you don't know when this podcast is recorded. Until Jack he's done a faux pas and revealed such secrets of Beyond the Text to the listener. But today we're going to be discussing St. Augustine. Now, you've been tackling some...
No, we're discussing Plato.
Oh, God.
You've got the Republic open in front of you.
Well, maybe it's just that I'm thinking how much Plato contributed to Augustinian thought.
Definitely,
Yeah.
definitely, that's true. And the City of God has a lot of parallels, not only with the book, but specifically with the chapter we're looking at, which is, and the third chapter, which deals a lot with the aesthetic, cultural interdicts and limitations intended for the preservation of morals and what else would you say, and even health and. So
fantastic.
Augustine had very similar taste.
Yeah.
Very similar anxiety about theatre and about poetry. By Augustine's time, there's now an academy.
Yes. Yeah.
And he's very critical of the academy. He thinks a lot of it is vanity. Plato will establish an academy.
Yes.
There isn't really such a thing in his day.
No, it will be the first
the
school.
poets certainly, and the people who present on the poets and so forth.
Well, I think that's a beautiful place for me to do an introduction to Plato, not to St. Augustine, and to delve into a little bit of the background to the politics of ancient Athens. I'm not going to go quite as long as I did in the History of Ideas Reading Club. If you're listening to this, you can listen to the episode prior, which is of our Reading Club session, and you can hear all the context that I add in there. But for this one, I'm just going to go straight into a bit of the politics of the day, and then into Book 3 of the Republic. And then we're going to get into some discussion, because it went on for about 45 minutes, my presentation, when we did the reading club. So we're going to skip some of that. But if you want to hear about things such as why do we look at concepts, not ideologies, what's the axial age, and every great book of Plato, then listen to the reading club session, because it's pretty insightful, if I do say so myself. So what was politics in ancient Athens? Well, the intellectual history of the politics of ancient Athens revolves around the emergence of democratia and the conceptual debates that accompanied it. In the late 6th century BCE, there were reforms which redefined the polis as a participatory entry or a participatory entity into which citizens could enter. And it emphasised isonomia. Am I pronouncing that right, Jack? Isonomia, maybe?
Isonomia.
Equality before the law, at least.
Okay. It sounds right.
Yeah, let's hope so.
It sounds right.
And direct governance through institutions like the assembly and the law courts. Yet Athenian democracy was never ideologically static. It was contested both in practice and in thought, with ongoing tensions over citizenship, elite influence, and the limits of popular rule. Intellectual historians such as Skinner and Pocock have highlighted the significance of Athens as a site where the language of political participation was first crystallised. However, they have also cautioned against, as Jack and I do also, imposing modern democratic ideals or this idea of the myth of prolepsis in any kind of concept or thinker that Jack and I have been tackling, in terms of imposing modern understandings of these things onto the past. Because Athens excluded many different participants from the polis, and its reliance on direct rule contrasts with later democratic ideas of constitutionalism. Plato famously critiqued democracy as unstable and prone to demagoguery, proposing a rule by an aristocracy. Meanwhile, sophists like Protagoras challenged the idea of fixed political truths, emphasising rhetoric and persuasion in shaping governance. These debates established the fundamental political concepts such as citizenship, deliberation, and constitutional order, whose influence extended through Rome into the Renaissance, that we'll be looking at next week, and into modern democratic thought. So, let's have a look at the Republic then. Book 3 of the Republic is what we're addressing today, and it continues Plato's exploration of justice, which he's already explored in the first couple of chapters of the Republic, and he focuses on education and the formation of the guardian class, those who will rule and defend the ideal state. Here Plato emphasises the role of paideia, again, and bastardisation or not, in terms of education. Paideia?
Paideia.
Yeah,
Right.
I think so.
Paideia.
Education and cultural formation, in shaping both individual character and civic harmony. He argues that the stories, music and poetry allowed in the polis must be carefully curated to instil virtues such as courage, discipline and reverence for the common good. The guardians in particular must be raised in an environment that fosters loyalty to the state and a commitment to truth rather than personal ambition or material wealth. This emphasis on cultural transmission closely relates to the concept of heritage that Jack and I are exploring in this series, the idea that values, myths and traditions of a society must be preserved and passed down to maintain stability and identity. Plato's concern with regulating cultural narratives reflects a broader tension in intellectual history. How far should heritage be actively shaped by elites? And to what extent should it evolve organically? His strict educational controls contrast with more pluralistic or historical understandings of heritage, where traditions are seen as fluid and subject to reinterpretation. Yet his work remains a key articulation of the power of cultural inheritance in shaping political order. So this is what we shall look at today, young Jack.
Very good. I look forward to it.
So Jack, you know what I'm going to say. When you were coming at this text as a philosopher, and as we know, all philosophy is but a footnote to Plato, other than it being in sheer reverence of your philosophical godfather and ancestors, how did you tackle the Republic itself? I mean, I know that you've read it before as a whole, so how do you think about the Republic, and then more specifically Book 3 after that?
Okay. I really love the Republic, but I understand that it's a book where one could easily be very dissatisfied with it and take it apart, really. It almost seems a bit trivial in parts, especially in this third chapter, which deals with the regulation of culture. It's very contrary to modern sensibilities to speak of such things, to consider such things as the regulation of culture. The idea that there could be music or poetry that inflames the passion and therefore is immoral. I mean, we don't really ascribe moral categories to art anymore.
No.
And yet, throughout our history, since Greek times, we have regulated art and culture in various forms. If it wasn't the government doing it, it was the church, or even the reformers following the church, imposing even stronger restriction than what the church had done. So this isn't atypical. We are atypical, and so how to understand this? And one of the things I would suggest for people approaching the Republic, not just this chapter but the broad thing, is that it's a book that's better approached in spirit rather than to the letter, because I think most people would find some of the examples quite trivial, and and maybe their triviality is because the sense of it has been lost to time.
Yeah.
Because, especially in the case of music, we know so little about ancient Greek music. We've barely been able to reconstruct it, its system and its sounds. That when we hear Socrates discouraging the use of the Lydian mode because it's too solemn, or the Ionian mode because it's too soft. Well, when we play those modes, maybe we don't agree.
Yeah.
But maybe it's because we do different things with those modes. We don't know the kind of rhythms and melodies, particularly melody, that they were constructing with these modes, and we have some idea, but it's not really possible to authentically.
No, and even the vehicle through which you would be performing them. Yeah. I mean, what would you be playing it on? A lyre?
So they use lyres, harps, a double-reeded flute instrument. That's very strange. They would sing as well, hymns to Apollo, for instance, the famous one that we reconstructed. I say that because I was a former musicologist.
The royal wit.
It's so happy to speak. So it's easy to dismiss a text for that reason that we have that distance, but I think that the challenge is to get into that way of thinking and understand, no, actually, we are affected by music, we are affected by culture, we are instructed by culture, we're taught how to behave, what is valuable and what is not valuable, by art, by poetry, by narrative, by story, as much as by the celebrities and our politicians. And so it actually is worth some serious thought. What ought we to value and what ought we to elevate in culture? Yeah. And these portions of the book are dealing with a serious critique of that, even if maybe misguided in parts or naive in parts, as far as we can tell. And I would say there are some things that are naive. I think the analysis of music is ultimately naive, but it starts from the right place. And as a philosopher, that's what most interested me about this book, that he has the right idea that there has to be some kind of effort at moral formation and at cultural formation, otherwise things do disintegrate, and so the ongoing debate is to what extent.
Yeah, completely. And of course you've got to remember two key historical factors here. Let's go bouncing off of Jack here for the first, which is that this is taking place in what Karl Jaspers defined as the axial age, so a period between about 800 BCE and 200 BCE, but those brackets are kind of a bit loose because sometimes Christ is included in this, so obviously that would be another couple of centuries. But what Jack has just defined in terms of how do you explore these virtues, how do you explore ethics, and then how do you come on to creating a system of statehood. These things are being explored, but a system of statehood that isn't just reliant on, say, despotism or something like that, or saying that essentially the gods descend from Olympus and become the kings, or this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. This is a period in which, across the world, simultaneously, scholars are thinking about the same question. So we see it in the Far East with Confucius. We see it in the Near East with, say, the development of thought in Zoroastrianism, and we see it in India with the Buddha, and we see it in the West in Greece. Now, these questions are being addressed about how do we live ethically, how do we create a political system that advocates ethics, which we've certainly lost in terms of political systems today, but maybe that'll lead to a re-emergence of it in the lack of, who knows.
I don't expect that. I'm giving sufficient thought, but certainly.
But these things were basically moving the kind of justification for a political state from, as I said, sort of combining myth with the day-to-day, so from combining the transcendent with the very physical, which had sort of been prior to Hellenistic Greece. In ancient Greece, that was how political structures were defined, through kind of mythic combinations with the physical world. For the first time across the globe, you have scholars thinking, well, actually, no, there's a division between the transcendent. They're both there, the transcendent and the physical, but they don't sort of mesh into this kind of, gunge of political thought that's sort of like, but I thought the spiritual is supposed to be completely withdrawn from politics. Well, yes, but sometimes they decide to walk down and make love to some queen, and that's a random dynastic kind of system. So across the globe, people are critically thinking about how do you create an ethical, well-structured political state. The second thing is that directly in relation to the Republic, you've just had the Peloponnesian War. So the Republic's written in around 375 BCE. The Peloponnesian War is raging from 431 to 404 BCE. And then from 404, when Athens loses to Sparta, you have the installation of the 30 tyrants for the year between 404 and 403. And we're not saying whether or not Plato has a overly positive view of the 30 tyrants, but his uncle and one of his cousins both sit within the 30 tyrants ruling Athens. And the book that we are addressing is extremely critical of democracy, and the 30 tyrants replace the previous democratic system in Athens. Ultimately, democracy is restored. So at the time that Plato is penning this work, there is democracy once again. So I think that can reveal a certain level of how he feels about, say, comparing the 30 tyrants to the democracy that he's writing in, because he's not writing it as a criticism of the 30 tyrants at their time of ruling. He's writing it when democracy has been restored. So those are two important contextual, one slightly more conceptual across around the world, and one for a little bit of more direct historical context. Would you add anything to that, Jack, in terms of the history there?
The philosophers, the scholars in philosophy would be a better way of putting it, often note that they suspect Plato's theory of forms and the downgrading of matter. The interpretive connection there to him growing up in the downfall of the 30 tyrants and the deposing of his family, basically. I mean, there's obviously other reasons, but it's curious that he took an interest in Heraclitus' view that the matter is in constant change. Just as political systems and society and the world order is in constant change, that turbulence seems to be what his philosophy tried to give some kind of expression to, but then tried to also orient towards a semblance of order. You do see him reject tyranny throughout this book, and he present. I mean, the task of this book is to figure out what is justice, and so to find what justice is, they have to figure out what a just state would look like, and he comes up with an entirely acceptable notion of justice. I would say the proper distribution of things where it ought to be, people in their appropriate stations according to their talents and interests, and resources, I think, similarly distributed. So it's not obvious that he is completely distorted, but he does have a keener eye for the limitations of democracy, for the weaknesses, and that wasn't new. We've just been studying the Peloponnesian War in Leiden.
Wonderful.
We've just finished, and Thucydides' history of that, although unfinished, is very good, very rich, and very informative. And you discover that, I mean, the height of this democratic Athens was under Pericles, and that's at the beginning of the war. And once he died, it is already disintegrating into, I guess, a kind of populism, not to impose that way of thinking too much onto the text, but the narratives that Thucydides reproduces is all about people trying to present what is not necessarily a favourable course of action into the most favourable way, or conversely, people react, more noble figures trying to react against the abuse of the public forum through very competent rhetoricians and people who are very persuasive and what do you say, polemic. You get a lot of that, a lot of Thucydides and all the statesmen are very well aware of the need to manipulate the people, even in democracy.
Completely.
And so, authentic Athenian democracy, not very, what do you say, it's not like it lasted very long, and it's probably unlikely that it was going very well under democratic or democracy. During Plato's adult years. So,
and then when it returns, it's still an instability in turmoil.
So all of which is to say, I wouldn't say it's so straightforward to write off the Republic as propaganda.
No. And of course, again, not that Jack and I fall prey to these things, which is why we're so wary of them, but Plato's Republic has been referred to by scholars like Karl Popper as the foundation for tyranny, for despotism in the 20th century. So he attributes the Republic to the rise of fascism and of communism.
That's right. I read those books.
Yeah.
I wasn't particularly impressed.
But on the flip side, you have someone like Brian Redhead, who titles his compilation of political thought From Plato to NATO, so this idea of political thought leading up to 20th and 21st century democracy. So we have a mixed bag when it comes to historical analysis of what Plato contributed, and I think it shows why you can't just draw these linear lines, as we keep saying.
Well, precisely because it is a complex text, because it is... what would you say? It's very difficult to encounter this text openly in the modern condition, partly for reasons I alluded to at the beginning. Also because liberty is not a concern.
No.
I mean, it's much more secondary. I mean, the delusion at the very end, just skimming over in our last chapter, that the man who rules himself is happiest. In comparison to the tyrant. And
there is this sort of political kind of, I don't know, again, we have to be very careful with semantics, particularly when we're tackling classics, which we're translating. But I mean, there is something in Book 3 as well about it would be better to die a free man than to live as a slave. And because that's one of the examples of the poems about, and he could be king of the dead men. But he said that, he'd prefer to die free rather than die a slave. So there is this kind of concept of liberty bouncing off.
That is also in Greek culture.
But it's not. It doesn't feel like it's been forged as a kind of political identity. It's more a virtue, isn't it? It's not. It's not a political concept to root around. It's a virtue to live up to. Would you say? It's not like Locke saying that liberty is something like that you should base your state on. It's more that a good state would have members who value their freedom, in a sense.
Maybe. This is complicated. So in both Herodotus and the Thucydides, there is repeated reference to some common ideas of liberty in reaction, first in Herodotus to the Persian invasion, but it's only when the Persians are invading that scene really emerges, and I think Aristodemus, one of the tyrants of Miletus, runs over to Sparta and says, "Spartan, you're going to be the slave, the liberators of Greece." And the same idea occurs in the Peloponnesian War. The Spartans are poised to be the liberators of Greece. Why? Because there's something about the Athenian Empire and the Persian before, which will place too much of a burden on the state, and that's primarily economic, and so it's not cultural freedom. It's I mean, I don't think they would have understood that, because I think for the reason maybe you're suggesting that freedom is a virtue. It's not just like an abstract right.
Exactly.
It's tailored towards certain conceptions of, we have to go to make these sacrifices routinely, and we have to serve one another and be a good member of the community. Greek ethics is very communal, as you've read also in Aristotle.
I mean, the only people who would probably believe in liberty as a political function would be the Cynics, and again, they wouldn't use the term, but if you take the Cynics, someone like Diogenes would say that the only kind of, some people draw the Cynics as kind of proto-anarchists, but again, we hate these terms, sort of hyphenated proto, pre-whatever. But they would see liberty as critical, but they probably wouldn't define it as liberty. They'd probably, if we had a term, it would probably be more agency or autonomy rather than liberty, to be able to be free to express themselves how they want without restraint. But other than them, who are quite niche and regarded as crackpots, and crapping in pots, as Diogenes does. Lovely little one there. Other than them, I wouldn't say that anyone's really regarding liberty, but they are regarding heritage. And Jack, how does Plato's concept of education in Book 3 of the Republic reflect the transmission of cultural heritage in the ideal state? What's he excluding? What's he including in these arts?
Okay, yeah. So again, the overall project is to ensure that the information and the skills received in education serve what the state needs to survive, and that is also what individuals need, because individuals come to the fullness of their being in the well-ordered state, because they're going to be put into the occupation that best serve their nature. And then they're going to be happy, to put it bluntly. But Plato's very sincere about that belief, and it seemed quite reasonable. You take it as a very loose anthropology or psychology.
Isn't there a dualism here that's raised somewhere else in the Republic about the well-functioning mind and the well-functioning state? A bit like how every part of the mind.
So the book has to constantly go back and forth between an analogy with the human person and the state. I think the inquiry into justice begins with the human person, and because they can't answer it, they have to consider the state. So they have to design a state, and then at the very end they can return to the human person. Which is why there is an underlying epistemological strain, dealing with what reason is, and then reason in relation to conduct, and then at some point you'll get his theory of the soul, and the parts of the soul, the rational principle and the emotive principle, and there is a third. I think feeling is distinct from emotion, perhaps, and the idea is basically that reason has to rule over the passions, to put it in the language of
tame the horses on the chariots, is it? Of this.
And not in an absolute, it's an image here.
To tame the passions that are the horses. Carrying reason.
Now, it's not in a completely oppressive and puritanical way. It's just the classic Christian virtue of temperance to read. Retroactively. Okay, so he has, bearing in mind how a person should conduct himself. Which I guess some basic ethical things which are taken for granted, let's say, which are also quite reasonable. There are a series of deductions are made about what constitutes good and bad poetry, good and bad music, what daily activities or weekly activities citizens should be getting involved in. So to walk through some examples, they talk about the gymnasium, they talk about learning an instrument. Those two things are supposed to complement one another, because too much of the gym makes one a brute, and too much of music makes one effeminate. And so they sort of balance each other's extremes.
And you don't want to be effeminate in Plato's Republic, because that's the land of, what is it he says, maddening poetry. Leave that for the women and lesser men.
Is that right?
The poetry that describes madness and storms and things in nature, he says, leave it for the women and lesser men. So you don't want to be effeminate in Plato's Republic.
No, and in fairness, maybe you don't want to. Maybe you don't want to be effeminate at all. I mean, I think there is a serious problem here, which is that, there are I think it's reasonable to recognise extremes of vice in both ends. An excess of indulgence and sensuality. Definitely, which is so you go that in music, in connection with music as well. He's concerned that the music is too soft, too sweet, too sad, too somber. And so he wants heroic music. It's very Soviet. He wants heroic music. No, seriously, it is. I think that it's there's a reason that the Soviet state talk about this also. Not to. I don't want to make too. I don't ultimately agree with Karl Popper that this is the foundation for tyranny, but there are some leading. That's certainly not how Plato saw it. Speaking of, did I mention poetry? No, I did. I think I mentioned something else. Anyway, poetry. That's another thing I've mentioned. Because poetry in Plato's day is designed to communicate theological information and also ethical information. That's where they begin. They begin with a critique of some of the ideas that are being transmitted in that tradition. Socrates was ultimately put to death because he opposed pantheism.
Yeah.
And he had a rational argument for opposing
Which
pantheism.
is a constant neurosis throughout Plato's works in their entirety, putting to death. Obviously, so much so in the Republic.
Yes, yeah.
But that takes place in when is it? It is. I did have it written down somewhere.
The book or the date?
The date of his execution.
Oh, I don't remember.
I did have it somewhere. Now I'm letting you all down.
Okay. But the basic argument was
399.
399, great. The basic argument was that the pantheistic conception of religion has the gods at war with one another, and so there's no unity to the hierarchy of virtues, and so there's no actual coherent moral message in pantheism, and therefore there's no coherent moral message in the poets.
Yeah.
Augustine will make a lot of similar criticisms against the Romans. And so this argument returned in the Republic. I think it was first made in the Meno,
right,
which is the dialogue on virtue. I'm trying to define what virtue is. But no, it's the Crito.
Oh, the Crito.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Whichever one they preface the that you can buy an anthology of the last days of Socrates.
It's Crito, I think. Yeah.
But also the Meno is about virtue. And they did a similar argument made. Anyway, so there are moral falsehoods in the poets for this reason. There are also theological or cosmological falsehoods according to Socrates. For instance, he's very dissatisfied with the teaching of about Hades, and part of the reason he's just dissatisfied with it is because it inspires fear, and that's not good enough for the state, which needs men to be courageous.
Yeah.
Okay.
It is the Crito.
It is the Crito. That's good to know. Okay. Have a broad overview. There's also a lot of mention of virtues such as temperance, courage, fortitude, which need to be transmitted. So it's not the outright rejection of poetry, it's the omission of verses, the censorship of specific verses.
Because it could lead to a fracturing of societal harmony, as you were saying.
Exactly. So in the level of the individual, it can inflame the passions, or it can disturb their reason, and therefore at the level of the society, it leaves people at odds with one another, or odds with the purpose that the society is there for, which is, I guess, to preserve itself and to not just preserve itself in the utilitarian sense, but to preserve itself in a just way.
Yeah, and in a similar in a similar sense, I suppose we should just quickly go over how you've got in Plato's Republic. You have this tripartite idea. So when we're talking about the idea of cultural transmission, we're talking about a specific class of people who need to be influenced, and I mentioned it in the introduction that it's the guardians. Now, there's the guardians, the auxiliaries, and the producers, the guardians being the sort of philosopher-kings and kind of other... I'm never really sure. Is it sort of like just a general term for rulers, the philosopher-kings, and sort of their kind of, I suppose, subordinates? Sort of like, or is it just the philosopher-kings?
My understanding it was a very specific term.
The guardians being just the philosopher-kings.
Because it's a very... in practice, maybe it is broader because there's a long selection process. There's a long process of selection through trial, which is also discussed in Book 3, to make sure that the appropriate virtues for leadership and the appropriate knowledge is there. But ultimately, it is a small class.
But these philosopher-kings and anyone else, as we say, within the guardian class, are the ones who are being who this kind of syllabus of art is being constructed for by Plato. Underneath them, you have the auxiliaries, who are the defenders of the state, the protectors of the state, and then you have the producer class, so the peasantry, who are keeping the state afloat with goods, food, everything that the state needs to run. This is in parallel to his tripartite view of the soul, where reason is the ruler, or wisdom, Then on the kind of warrior or auxiliary class, you've got the spirit, which is courage as a virtue. And then you've got appetite, so the producers producing the food, the grain, etc. And that idea is moderation. So I thought that would just be a good place to insert that to know who we're talking about when it comes to this chapter, and specifically the ruling class. I don't know whether you as well, because although it's not in this book, it is useful to explain the idea of the metals and the cast in gold, silver, and bronze. In terms of the caliber of the ruling class.
Right, you'll have to walk through this one. I haven't refreshed that one for this.
Well, essentially, the idea that there's the guardian class, the philosopher-kings, need to essentially they're ranked in these metals, so gold, silver, bronze. Again, a tripartite system, and for the ruling class, you need to have a heart of gold, which then will mean you are cast in gold as the ruling class. And this is the basis for some interpretations of Plato that oppose the kind of elitist, dictatorial, despotic kind of view that we've been discussing, and the idea that actually he expounds a more meritocratic system. So there can be a ruling class member of the Guardians, a philosopher-king, who gives birth to a son, and it would be a son because, well, he does mention philosopher-queens somewhere, I think, but I don't think, I think it's a bit like Rousseau, it's sort of like awkwardly positioned on the edge of the main discourse. Sure. So it is predominantly focused on men and property-holding men. There are also, of course, slaves in Athens at this time. They can't take part in democracy in Plato's day, so they would be excluded from this system as well. But if someone who was with a heart of gold, cast thereby in gold as the ruler, gave birth to a son, it is possible that that son, whilst cast in gold, so being in the lineage of the ruler, might indeed have a heart of bronze, which means that they would be deselected from the ruling class. This isn't a, you can counter me, Jack, if you want, but I think you probably agree. I don't think this isn't a moral judgment, because this comes back to what Jack was saying at the start about knowing your station. Yeah. That it's not that producers are lesser in a sense. Obviously, it is tiered, but it's not that they're lesser in moral quality, or in terms of a value judgment at least. It's not that they're lesser. It's just that they've reached their self-actualization. What Aristotle will go on to call eudaimonia, in terms of their flourishing. Yeah.
No, that's right, because the idea is that not only are people ineffective outside of their station, they're also unhappy.
Yeah, exactly.
And that seems reasonable. I mean, part of the problem that people have with this doctrine is too black and white. I'm sure people have multiple interests and multiple competencies. Yeah. But this is part of what I meant when I prefaced this talk with how to approach this text. Well, you approach it in the spirit, as it were.
Exactly.
Here's a good example.
And also the same thing could happen on the opposite end of the spectrum, that someone is cast in bronze and part of the producer class, and actually has a heart of gold and can ascend.
And it's interesting, because that's also the more, I guess, what would you say, humane understanding. So there is a tradition in antiquity, and also I think in the biblical corpus of the emphasis on the family lineage. And you're sort of identified by your family. I don't fully know the context of how much this is also true of Plato's day. I imagine that's common. This seems quite radical. That you can look through someone's heritage and see an individual with his own merits and competencies and interests. Yeah.
Well, I think this comes back to what I was saying about the axial age, and this being a quintessential text in the sense that it's not that Athena came down and made love to a man, and therefore his dynasty of people should be ruling. You know, at the same time as Plato's critiquing democracy, he is critiquing other political systems as well. Exactly. I think that's true. Did you have a question, Jack, or would you like me to pose another?
I don't have one.
Well, I have something that I think you'll like. Yeah. What role do stories, music, and poetry play in shaping the values of the guardian class?
Right. Well, I guess we've discussed that to some degree, but we can go deeper.
And how does it result in manipulation or preservation of heritage. When we were discussing a few bits of this earlier and how the book ends with some deceit, even though...
This is really interesting. Okay, so, to start there. So the book begins with a critique of poetry because the poets are lying about moral and theological and cosmological ideas, or at least they are presenting what is false in ignorance of the fact that it's false. But the book ends with Socrates saying we have to lie to the people we're trying to educate in order to get them on board. And he has this narrative. So he's going to tell them about the idea that some of them are cast in bronze and all this, and there can be these kind of movements up and down the hierarchy that we described. But before this, he's going to tell them that they were born in that their whole time of education and training was a dream, an illusion, was not real, and that in fact they were born and nurtured in the womb of their of the earth, the womb of the earth. And a question immediately arises: is that a contradiction? Is he undermining himself? Is he, on the one hand, criticizing deceit, and on the other, allowing it for his own purposes, and the purposes of the state? Or is this something a bit more subtle? And my interpretation of it was that, well, I don't think, from Plato's perspective, that narrative is false.
No.
It's poetic, and it's symbolic, and it's allegorical, but it's true.
Yeah.
And the point is that in the democracy, people are not going to willingly assent to giving up their traditions.
Yeah.
In large part because the traditions are promoting vice.
Yeah, exactly.
And are not calling them to something higher, something purposeful. What Plato is walking us through is education, but also discipline.
Yeah.
And so this needs to be presented in as favourable and as desirable a way as possible, and that's where this myth comes in. And he's aware this is actually a difficulty. He said, any immediate objections, and someone says, well, the first generation aren't really going to buy this, but maybe their sons, and maybe their sons' sons.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Let's hope.
And so there's awareness that this is attending to a political problem.
And of course, there is a question of if these things are self-knowing in nature, why is the state not like that in the first place?
Yeah.
Which is an issue which most political philosophers end up grappling with, because they write a political treatise about how this is the way that things should be.
Yeah.
And then they always get to that point in the book where it's like, well, oh, shit.
Yeah.
Well, if I've said that it should be, why isn't it?
Well, I mean, I think Plato had a good answer to that. Maybe not the answer, but a good one. It's that reason has not prevailed.
Yes.
And actually, it's a great effort to have a just society, and a great effort to be bound to a common purpose rather than individual desire.
We were having a laugh about this in the reading club, actually, about how, again, like some later philosophers, there is a lot of reliance on functional reasoning, and usually the answer is that reason hasn't fully functioned well, and how would a state come to right itself? Well, everyone would reason well.
And so this is, if you take that point of Plato's quite seriously, then it seems to be a bit naive, but one cannot deny that part of what goes wrong in society, that there is insufficient serious thought and reflection about what we should be doing together.
No, completely.
It has to be from first principles, not necessarily, but even just to think a little bit about action and consequence, and maybe why temperance might be good. For that reason. You do a bit of introspection. You asked about music.
Yes,
That's very interesting.
Very much so. Please, Jack, delve into
my background. came into philosophy through music.
He was a DJ.
Not quite. So more than any other art, the question of the relationship between music and ethics and music and emotion and music and meaning is the most controversial. Meaning in poetry is pretty self-evident. And in art also, I would say, comparatively. But in what sense can you convey an image in music, for instance? In what sense can you convey a political idea in music? And the thing is, in some sense, you seem to be able to do so, because we know the pieces of music that we associate with great landscapes, the Hebrides Overture or something, or Beethoven Pastoral Symphony. We also know we can't not hear Shostakovich and think of the Soviet Union. And hear the falsity of that and playing with that. But what is the basis for that? But what is the basis for that? Is that meaning purely added on through social conditioning, or is it intrinsic to the musical properties, or some combination of them? And I think the answer is both. But Plato seems to be quite serious that it is property of music, property of sonority, property of harmony, property of rhythm, and that's not a ridiculous proposition. Rhythm immediately obvious. The way music invites you to move with each other, or just on your own, it tells you a little something about how to act in the world.
It's why we go clubbing. Well, I don't personally.
Yeah. But exactly. So what's going on in the clubs? Everyone is losing themselves to the hypnotic beat. Exactly. I don't know what song you're playing in your head, but I don't want it. Shostakovich. Similarly, the beat is used in military march to maintain order. So
think of a glorious Prussian march.
Rhythm is very effective. It's very visceral. And it is appropriate to certain ways of conducting yourself. To letting loose in the club or to marching on military. What's curious is it's actually the same rhythm. So that's ambiguous. But I think it is the rhythm that's affording that, because not all rhythms do it. It's a specific rhythm that enables that. So it already is complicated. Okay, what about harmony? It's too simplistic to say that there are happy and sad harmonies, because in the right context, a minor chord can have not necessarily a happy connotation, but something just that's not straightforwardly sad. Or conversely, a major chord can function in a melancholic way, like a wistful way. Or it can be very bright in a very uncomfortable way. Like I'm thinking of some of Scriabin's piano sonatas, where the sonorities of major and minor and other more complex chords completely lose that very elementary meaning.
And obviously in religious stuff, I mean, a plagal cadence doesn't necessarily mean joyous, does it? Like a sort of amen finish, even though it's major, it can be it can, as you say, wistful or kind of like contemplatory.
And so the sounds have many possibilities for what they can mean, and I think that is partly in relation to the context in which they're used. So there is a social dimension to it, I would never deny it, but it's only effective because there's something in those musical elements that affords that. Okay, the Lydian mode and the Ionian mode are mentioned. If we play those, do we really feel what Plato ascribes to them? I think so. I mean, the Ionian mode is just a major scale. I think that's soft in comparison to the others. I think that's a fair assessment. The Lydian mode is, imagine a major scale, but the fourth note you raise. So you include the raised fourth degree, which introduced the tritone interval to the scale, to the major scale, except for where it was already included in the between the fourth, the lower fourth, and the seventh.
They
bring the so this So what it means is that the first 4 notes of the Lydian scale proceed by a whole tone. It has a slightly augmented flavour to it. Is it somberful? I don't know. That's something I haven't necessarily felt, but it is a bit. I've always felt the Lydian scale to be a bit jarring in a certain way. But he also calls it soft.
Right.
With the Ionian mode. So there are ambiguities.
And like with semantics, of course, delving into musicology is difficult when it comes to trying to interpret these things without traditional instruments as well.
Oh, very much. I mean, we know a little bit about the traditional instruments and how they were used. I mean, we know about the kitharod, played a kithara, which was a kind of lute. And
the lyre.
We know a little bit, but trying to get a full reconstruction of how those elements come together. It's only really when those elements come together that you understand how each functions. And whether it's happy, sad, courageous. You can't really. The point is, you can't reduce it to the individual elements. That's something Plato does try to do here, and it is a little naive.
Yeah, completely. And he certainly throughout the text has a fixation on music. I mean, in book 1, he says, well, musicians will hardly use their skill to make their pupils unmusical, or riding masters to make their pupils bad horsemen. So, I mean, he's certainly fixated on creating a good system of the arts, of education. And I guess what you're about to go on to say is, how does he do that? What's he focusing on rooting out?
Yeah, so he's rooting out all the things which inflame the passions, or which depress us, or make us too effeminate, or make us too strong. He's trying to filter out everything which is not conducive to the well-proportioned individual who is courageous but also prudent and tempered. So who has zeal for his country.
Which of course is interesting, because we're going to go on to look at Romantics later in this series, and it really shows how heritage changes, because I mean the Romantics passion and evoking nostalgia and these sorts of things are so critical to Romantic composers, to Romantic writers, Byron, who we're going to look at. It's interesting.
Yes, and there that the recovery of certain elements of heritage, let's say a return to nature, call it, as a cultural idea, a cultural concept. A return to love and a return to passion.
It's specifically focused on evoking desire.
It's associated with vitality. Against the mundane and the industrial and the ills of social living. It's associated with moral formation. So it's interesting how those attitudes do change.
But that's what we're here for, to explore how
well,
those
exactly.
attitudes
But
change.
what's interesting, I don't think of any of the philosophers we're going to look at, including Plato. Not what's interesting in a series about heritage, which is a very conservative concept. None of them are uncritical about it. They all have very distinctive ideas about in what way heritage is good, in what way it becomes denatured or corrupted, and comes to just promote vice and just becomes an excuse for living in a way that is unproductive or immoral. Especially in the context of Rome, St. Augustine will explain. At great length.
Completely. Another question for you, Jack.
Okay.
In what way does Plato argue further about myths and how society should be controlled? And how does control of heritage impact the citizens' sense of identity, their place in the state, in this kind of tripartite system? How would you say myth is used?
Myth? That's a good question. So we had the myth of the earth. As the womb. There's the myth of the cave. Now that's a very interesting one. There's a thread throughout this chapter, particularly in connection to the poets and the people who perform poetry, the imitators, people who practice the mimetic art, from which we get the word to mime. That there's something dangerous in imitation. the point about heritage. So heritage and tradition should be about right imitation, what is worthy of imitation.
Yeah.
What is worthy of preservation is worthy because it will help continue to preserve society. So this is about rediscovering the great stories and practices and ideas which are conducive to good living and conducive to a healthy state. Now, with the poets, you get a very visceral example of this because they act out, or the actors who are reciting poetry or performing it in the tragedies and comedies, they're acting out ways of living.
Yeah.
And Socrates asks whether that is worth imitating.
Yeah.
And so you have to filter that out. Now, I mention this because the myth of the cave seems to have some distant relationship to this, because the myth of the cave is this idea that we're born in a kind of ignorance. We're positively engaged with a reality which isn't a reality in reality.
Very meta.
Yeah. We're looking at shadows and images of what is real. And we can become conscious of this, and when we become conscious of this, we can then abandon the shadows and images, move beyond them, and try and encounter what is real. What is the cause of those shadows and images? What is it the shadows are shadows of? And I detect a connection there with the poets and the actors, that there's something inferior in Plato's ontology about imitation. But it's useful as a vehicle to move through. So imitation is sanctioned with qualification in chapter 3, because it's good to imitate good patterns of behaviour. Yeah. But it's a vehicle to move through to the reality, which in very Greek, to participate in the being of the form or the form of this behaviour, to become one with that form, to use your imitation of good behaviour to really become that person. And that's exactly what the myth of the cave illustrates.
And to help free your fellow prisoners of the cave as well.
Yes, that's also important. The idea is that we mentioned earlier that the importance of reason. That's what the cave is about. It's a little bit about the use of reason to make an ascent from the shadows and images to the fullness of reality. John Henry Newman had a spin on this. He talked about moving from shadows and images to the fullness of truth and love, which is very beautiful.
Yeah, very nice.
And I think it is in reference to Platonism. So there is an ascent of the individual, and then the aiding the ascent of your compatriots. And that mirrors the educational process. But it's also the pursuit of wisdom, which in other dialogue, maybe not here, I can't remember, Socrates argues is soteriological. Is a route to salvation.
And he doesn't need me to say it. Plato is so astute on many things. he'll be pleased to have had my commendation. But he says in that myth about how there will be prisoners who won't want to leave, even though they've been offered the truth, and that's exactly what we see when it comes to critical thinking, and that's why we do need philosopher-kings such as this man who should be crowned, to enlighten us, because it makes us think differently from the way we were reared and raised. And Plato is saying that, and as much as we don't like to draw on things and just supplant them into our own time, I think it's a really interesting parallel that Plato is saying that there will be people who don't want to withdraw from their nice closeted kind of view of the world to actually think freely, openly and critically about the world. There's going to be people who feel safer because that's the world they know, and in their mind actually they understand the world more than they will if they start to open up beyond that paradigm within which they're operating. so astute and so relevant. I think if there are any perennials, I think that is a really sort of perennial wisdom from Plato that runs through political and ethical studies in history.
Yeah, definitely. And I think part of the point of this book is to explore how tradition can be the cause of that narrow living.
Yeah.
But also the rectification of traditions and the purification of traditions is the basis for legitimate dissent.
Yeah.
It almost parallels the Christian idea of moving sort of a bit beyond the old law through it to the spirit that underlies it. Well, you've got to sort of look for the spirit of tradition, I guess, in Plato, the most beneficial point of origin it could have, which is to direct it all, to orchestrate it all towards right conduct.
There is a bit where he says in that myth about how when he thought of his first home, the cave, and what passed for wisdom there, and of his fellow prisoners, don't you think he would congratulate himself on his good fortune and be sorry for those others? And I was saying to Jack earlier that then it kind of becomes slightly, at least to me, in the vein of the kind of Popper analysis of kind of like this one leader who's going to rise up through the ranks and sort of say, oh, don't worry, I know you don't understand, but I understand, and I can lead us to victory. And, you know, that is a slight kind of shift away from the kind of like critical analysis of freedom of thought that we were just discussing, versus, you know, the idea of this one individual rising up and saying, don't worry, I lead the way and I'll show you truth, sort of thing. So I can see a flip side to it as well.
Yeah.
But on the myths, he, in book 3, talks about getting rid of these things like the rivers of wailing and gloom that have been discussed in, I think, the Odyssey and in the Iliad. And removing them because these things institute an anxiety, and these pitiful laments by famous men must be removed from our canon of study. So, not to inculcate those kind of inferior emotions.
Yes.
Was there anything else, Jack, in particular that you wanted to explore in our discussion here?
Perhaps truth and art. We talked a bit about emotion and art, but at least mostly music. Truth and music was something that I thought maybe was worth mentioning. It's slightly different. And truth and even truth in painting.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Does that just mean an authentic reproduction of something? There is a brief commentary, I think, in one of the very late chapters on the artist and how he creates an imitation, and how the imitation is inferior. But one of the interesting things we saw with the Soviet period in particular was
Soviet realism.
Soviet realism, which is a fascinating aesthetic, and I actually quite enjoy it in a perverse way. Because it's very interesting to get a feel for the way that I think better than any other example you can find, art is something which is sensitive to truth, which is a vehicle for truth.
And obviously that's responding against a backdrop of not the surrealists, but sort of the what are they called, the structuralists and the kind of modernists of the 20s that are starting to depict things in slightly wild and wacky ways. So things like Kandinsky, things like
this is sort of like expressionism, or it comes out of expressionism, and there's a few other names you can throw around. Increasingly abstracting from human experience, let's say, which is, I guess, of primeval importance to Marx's theory. Something about the soil, which is very important in Marxism, economically and socially, also aesthetically. And so Soviet realism initially is a return to more traditional music. But it again, with the undertones that you do get in chapter 3, it must be said it must be geared toward the heroic, and making everyone very energetic about the Soviet project.
Yeah.
And this stringency of that doctrine soon was relaxed.
Yeah.
But also, consequently, the policy became much more ambiguous, and that was politically expedient.
Yeah.
But one of the important things you see is the heroic elevation of something which we know is false and evil in many things that came out of that regime, and yet how it's depicted in art. And that's so palpable when you see it. It's even just in the way that it's even in the aesthetic. It's very, it's almost very cubist the way that the Soviet figures are, at least in certain art, very blocky. And you see the sculptures, they're very blocky.
Certainly, particularly of like the war.
It's got a real edge to it. Very rough, and it's because the men and women of the working world are uniting, and there's this militaristic aspect,
and in the paintings of society, they will be in blocks of society. There will be the soldiers, there will be the farmers, the auxiliaries, the producers, and the philosopher-kings, the party. So completely, and everyone looking satisfied with their station. You know, the farmers on the kolkhoz or the stovkhoz of the collective farms, all joyous, holding bundles of wheat or that sort of thing. So everyone, theoretically at least, being content with their station.
And so we know, therefore, how art can be abused for ideological purposes.
And abused in odd ways. And this is where I struggle with Plato, because, and using this example, people like Kandinsky, people like Malevich, people like it's more understandable why it was done away with in Cologne, where you had the Cologne modernists because of the Nazis and their absolute detesting of abstract art. But a lot of these people were socialists, the ones that the Soviets reacted against. So people who had the same ideals as who would go on to create this Soviet realism. And this is the issue that I find with Plato, which is that in his ruling out of these forms of art, whether it be poetry, whether it be myth, whether it be art itself, music, you limit your critical ability to actually explore the idea of eudaimonia, of flourishing, because, a lot of these myths, poems, as much as they might harbour vices, we were saying earlier about ontic evils, about kind of things that happen in the world that are bad. He discusses not putting in terrible storms and things like that because it might lead to anxiety, and you should leave madness to the maddening women or lesser men, as we were saying earlier.
But also, more basically, intemperance and vengeance and strife and murder and all these kinds of things. Vengeance.
How do you measure the good if you don't have the bad alongside it? And this is an issue that's grappled in Irenaean theodicy and throughout Christian scripture. But if you don't have the bad to compare against, how do you expand your critical ability as a state, and as a state cultivating what he wants to be, critical agents?
That's a very good question. I mean, the Christian answer to that is subtle. And of all the people, it was Carl Jung who maybe presented the most interesting contrast. In his autobiography, he writes a bit about the contrast between Eastern and Western spirituality. And in, I think it was the Hinduism in the East, they have a lot of voluptuous, very visceral, voluptuous statues. And it was like, well, why? It's designed to inspire, particularly in young men, lust. And they are very attracted to those statues, and really obsessed with them. And then eventually they realise that they're in that state. And that moment is the moment of conversion to morality.
Exactly.
But the Christian idea was different. It's totally different, and it's in a throwaway passage from Romans, St. Paul's letter. He's critiqued the law because the letter of the law can't save and all are condemned by it. But the law is still holy and good, says St. Paul, because it made me first know sin. So it was the commandment that made me know sin, not sin.
It
was, because because it's just the sin is a condition. So there isn't the perfect society. It's not possible. There's no such thing. There will never be such thing on the Christian ontology.
In the city of God.
Yes, but that does on this
not on this
life. So
mere temporal plane.
And so so the basic idea is that, I guess it overcomes this difficulty. Do you have to know the bad to know the good? You actually just need to know the good to know the bad and the good.
Yes.
On the Christian view.
Yeah.
Because you already carry the bad.
Yeah, I guess so.
You don't need the poets to tell you what it is.
But say Athenian troops are going up against Spartans, and all they've been taught is virtue. How are they to decipher whether or not their cause is good if they don't know what the vice is?
No, that's right. But this is the respect in which these discussions are far too abstract, because that's not a real situation. Where people aren't aware of because of their lived experience, even in small ways, they can understand with a bit of imagination the ways in which vice multiplies exponentially on the global scale. But you can't do it in the reverse way. You understand the scale of global vices and wars and political intrigues through your own knowledge of what it might mean to lie to someone, or to take vengeance, or to assault someone, or to harbour resentment.
And obviously, is it humane? I mean, in the Enlightenment, scholars like Bernard Mandeville will say that private vices are beneficial for the public good. I mean, are we actually furthering the cause of a successful state if we're limiting people to only thinking virtuously consistently on a simply economic basis of the functioning of the state? I don't know.
What would his argument be?
That private vices, things that may, I think, benefit myself, might actually be better than if I was consistently thinking about the public good, because I'd be thinking, I can't do this because actually, this little scheme that I've come up with to sell my apples for this is getting me money, but obviously, if I sell my apples rather than just giving them out, I might get money to invest in a project that I can do more rapidly than a great big, state scheme that would eventually, create what I was going to create, but as an individual, because I've sold those apples instead of giving them out for free, it's a private vice, but now I've put the money into building a school, or into building some kind of academy like place.
There's more of a utilitarian argument.
I would say just more a sort of like a classical economist kind of view, that having to abide by simply the common good can actually limit the benefit of a well-functioning society.
Because it curbs ambition.
And free thinking.
Okay.
So these are just ideas that I'm sort of thinking about when we're talking about only creating a virtuous society, and how well that society would actually function in practice. What would it do? What would it achieve? Is there a possibility curve, as we say in economics? A possibility curve. Would it reach Plato's kind of outer possibility curve and then just die? If the state is only going to reach that, there doesn't seem that much opportunity within what he's saying to go beyond sort of where he's thinking society can go. I don't know if I'm explaining myself particularly well. I just worry that his vision of the state would get to his perfection, and then there wouldn't really be any room to explore anything further.
I think this is related to perhaps a naive conception of what politics is for. Politics is deductive science. This book sort of presupposes. No, it's ongoing. Because that state is never reached. Because the world is temporal. Everything is changing. In so many ways you can't keep track of. This is Hayek again. And so there is a continuous need to in small ways, maybe in large ways, reinvent the way politics is being done locally and on a larger scale. So yes,
because there are virtuous societies that don't change, and they keep their heritage, going back to the core topic of what we're discussing within, say, Buddhist communities in the East, whether that be in Nepal or whether it be in the prior Tibet that's now occupied. These countries keep their traditions and they're virtuous and we admire them, but do they go far beyond that in terms of attaining, perhaps if the focus wasn't solely on virtue but on far more, there could be possibility for them to become great players on the global stage, for example.
Right. Yeah, so this was, I detected this a bit in the way you were framing it. I think it's a completely modern idea from the economics thinkers. And this is the question, is what the society should be aiming for the maximizing of wealth?
Yeah.
And in many ways you see that's inimical to virtue, because it's traditionally conceived.
Yeah. Yeah,
and
he says that, doesn't he? Somewhere further in the text, there's something about government by the truly rich. Though that's a brilliant page turn to go straight to the passage that I was thinking of. There's no bookmark, there's no cheating. That was astonishing. Governed by the truly rich, those, that is, whose riches consist not of money, but of the happiness of a right and rational life.
Yeah, right. And I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah. I don't disagree, just to say.
Yes.
But
this is why this is one reason why there will be critical discussion about the use of what Plato's saying. Practically, and whether some of these virtues, one of the motives to undermine a transcendental account of virtue is perhaps the economic.
But I'm not solely talking about material benefits. Maybe we're going a bit too far beyond trying to think about this, because as you say, I am sort of applying it in a very kind of like, if this state was realised, and as you've said, I don't know whether Plato ever actually thinks that it would be, or not.
There's a story that he did travel somewhere to try and establish this state and failed quite miserably.
And there's parallels with Atlantis and those kind of myths that he's writing about prior as well, about utopian states. I mean, the actual formation of the Republic, I think, is pretty similar to our ideas of Atlantis, in the sense that I think, if I've got this completely wrong, then tell me, but I'm pretty sure that he talks about rings and about how there would be rings of different, like the way the Republic would be sort of circles of different kind of like the class system, with producers, auxiliaries on the outside, the philosopher-kings right in the centre, and it's very similar to his depiction of Atlantis. So there is this utopianism there, but I just wonder whether, even when it comes to virtue, again, if you're not able to explore vice, it's like in A Clockwork Orange, it's just as unnatural to be completely good as it is to be completely evil. Like, it's a balance, and to try and remove that human balance, and this is something obviously that Aristotle will take away and explore in terms of the golden mean and in terms of virtue ethics, in terms of finding that balance. If you don't do that, doesn't society just stall a little bit, even if they're truly virtuous in their conception of virtue? Well, do you have any final pointers, Jack, to say? Do any nice little segues into next week's topic?
That maybe, and that is a good place to round up on, because there is quite a lot in common between specifically this chapter, which deals with culture, and Augustine's City of God, which begins with a very scathing, very long, over many chapters, scathing critique of Greek and Roman society on various points, the kind of brutal games they would enjoy, the content of their poems and their plays, the inner contradictions of their pantheism, internal to the logic of the pantheistic sort, but also contradictions in how it was practiced. So the law would prohibit certain things, and yet one would assume that the origin of the law and the origin of the myths were identical, and why would there therefore be a contradiction between what the myths were saying and what the law had determined. And Augustine is pointing out all these contradictions to show that the Romans did know, many of them did know, that the myths were immoral and counterproductive.
Yeah.
And this is argument needs to be made in the context of the accusation that the fall of Rome in 410 is due to the abandonment of pagan practices. And so that's why Augustine is writing about this. So those, a lot of similar comments are made. Much more, except with Augustine, much more emphasis on lust and on wealth.
Yeah.
Than on, what would you say, on the kind of virtues that are being dealt with in Plato's work are more to do with temperance. I guess it's similar. Courage, fortitude, important Christian virtues. But Augustine detects a lot more what we would call degeneracy in Roman culture and in Plato's day, let's say.
One thing Jack has omitted, because I think he's scared that classicists are going to come after him, is that before this he said that he thinks that The Republic is a terrible book. But he is right, because in the Greek Reader, so Penguin's series compilations of text, so you have the Enlightenment Reader, that my one is well worn. You have the Hannah Arendt Reader, you have all manner of ones. The Republic doesn't feature once.
No.
In all excerpts of ancient Greek thought, the Republic is just not there.
No.
That I think that's an interesting omission.
It is interesting. I mean, I think part of it though, it is so huge.
Yeah.
So if you're going to make an anthology, you're probably going to make it with a collection of the smaller ones.
Yeah.
And the Republic.
Oh no, but these are all excerpts. They're not whole books in here.
Oh, I understand.
That's what I mean. There's not a single excerpt from the Republic.
Also because a lot of overlap with the other dialogue. But yeah, no, that is a bit strange. Maybe because if you want to take an excerpt, you have to take quite a lengthy amount of text out of it.
Yeah.
Other thing, it does make for a tedious read.
Which is possibly why it's fallen prey to all of these interpretations.
Yeah.
Because those who come at it to try and form their political ideas from it will take an excerpt without reference to.
That's easy to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
So
but also
that shows the importance of reading coherently and the importance of intellectual history.
But also just to say, I think part of why it's probably not included is that it just does not. It's not a book that appeals to modern sensibility. It's not a book people are prepared to receive wisdom from. They abandon a lot of preconceptions.
Yeah.
I think that's quite difficult.
No, I agree, and I think we've tackled it in the best way that we can without our modern conceptions, even though, as you've seen, they sneak in there in the way that we analyse it politically, economically, ideas of virtue. But regardless of that, I think it's been a great exploration, don't you, Jack?
It's been very good, yes.
And I look forward to going to St Augustine next week, and Jack will be on the other side of the sea. So thank you very much indeed. Goodbye.